No, no, this can't be happening. Those were the first words out of my husband's mouth when he stood frozen on our front porch with a suitcase in one hand and his girlfriend beside him. The champagne bottle slipped from Claire's fingers and shattered across the brick walkway. For a moment, nobody moved. Not Mark, not Claire, not the neighbors gathered across the street pretending not to stare, and certainly not me. I stood in the doorway of the house where I'd spent the last 31 years of my life holding a manila folder against my chest. Then I smiled. A real smile. The kind I hadn't worn in a very long time. But to understand why Mark Harper looked like he'd just seen a ghost that Saturday afternoon, you have to go back exactly 1 week. Back to Tuesday night. Back to dinner. Back to the moment my marriage ended. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 58 years old, and until last spring I believed I had a predictable life. I lived in Asheville, North Carolina. I drank coffee on the back deck every morning. I waved to the same neighbors. I shopped at the same Ingles grocery store. And for 31 years I was married to the same man. Or at least I thought I knew the man I was married to. That Tuesday had started like any other. I spent the morning answering emails for our accounting business. Mark had built the company years ago, but I'd been handling the books, client scheduling, payroll, and tax preparation support for nearly 2 decades. People always called it Mark's business. I never corrected them. I didn't care about credit. I cared about keeping things running. Around 5 o'clock I started dinner. Meatloaf. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Nothing fancy. Just the kind of meal we'd eaten hundreds of times before. Mark came home around 6:30. He barely looked at me. At first I assumed he'd had a bad day. Tax season had always made him cranky, but something felt different. He was strangely calm, almost rehearsed. We sat down at the kitchen table at exactly 6:45 p.m. I remember the time because the local news was playing softly from the television in the family room. A weather report. Traffic updates. Normal life. Then Mark cleared his throat. There's something we need to discuss. I set down my fork. Okay. He folded his hands together. No hesitation. No guilt. No discomfort. Just a man delivering information. Claire is moving in next month. I blinked. I'm sorry. Claire. He said it like I should know exactly who that was. I didn't. At least not immediately. Then I remembered. Claire Reynolds. A woman who worked at an upscale furniture showroom downtown. I'd met her once at a business networking event. Tall. Blonde. Maybe 38. Maybe younger. I stared at him. The words took a few seconds to arrange themselves into something that made sense. And when they finally did, I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was impossible. You're joking. I'm not. The room suddenly felt smaller. What do you mean she's moving in? Mark looked down at his plate. Then back at me. We've been seeing each other. The sentence landed like a punch. How long? His answer came far too quickly. A little over a year? A year. An entire year. 365 days of lies. I sat there staring at him while the kitchen clock ticked loudly behind us. Finally, I asked the question everyone asks. Why? He sighed. Not sadly. More like someone explaining a decision he'd already made. Claire makes me happy. I wish I could tell you I threw my water glass. Or screamed. Or stormed out. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you're too shocked to react. I simply sat there, listening, watching, trying to understand how the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 decades could sound so detached. Mark kept talking. Something about new beginnings. Something about finding himself. Something about not wanting to waste the rest of his life. The phrases blended together. Every cliché in the world suddenly lived in my kitchen. Then came the part that hurt most. Not because it was cruel. Because it was practical. You're going to need to move out. I looked up slowly. What? By Friday. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Friday. That gives you 3 days. 3 days. 31 years of marriage. 3 days to leave. I stared at the family photos on the wall behind him. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. Birthday parties. A lifetime. Reduced to a deadline. Then Mark added something that made my stomach turn. The house stays with me. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed the matter was settled. Done. Finished. Claire would move in. I would move out. End of story. The strange thing is that anger never arrived. Not right away. Instead, I felt tired. Deeply tired. Like someone had unplugged me from my own life, and that's when I smiled. Mark looked confused. What? I shook my head. Nothing. You're taking this better than I expected. That almost made me laugh. Better. I was sitting in the ruins of my marriage. But I remembered something my father used to say, something he'd repeated throughout my childhood. Never argue with someone while they're busy making a mistake. So I simply nodded. If that's what you want. The relief on Mark's face was immediate, which told me everything. He'd expected a fight, a scene, resistance. Instead, he got agreement, and that made him careless. Very careless. Later that night after he'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the attic searching for old family photo albums. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe I needed something familiar, something real. The attic smelled like cedar and dust. Boxes lined the walls. Most hadn't been opened in years. Around midnight, I found an old metal lockbox tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. I almost ignored it. Then I saw my father's handwriting on the lid. And suddenly my pulse quickened, because my father had been dead for 12 years. And whatever was inside that box was about to change everything. I sat on the attic floor with that old metal lockbox in front of me, listening to Mark snore through the ceiling below. It was a strange sound to hear right then. Normal. Ordinary. A husband asleep in his own bed. Except my husband had just told me his girlfriend was moving into my house and I had 3 days to get out. The box was gray scratched around the edges and heavier than it looked. My father had written Linda House Papers on a strip of masking tape across the top. I ran my thumb over his handwriting. My father, Earl Thompson, had been a practical man. He drove the same Ford pickup for 19 years, kept every receipt in a shoebox, and believed nothing important should ever be handled with a handshake alone. When Mark and I bought the house back in the early 90s, Daddy had helped us with the down payment. At least that was what I thought. I remembered him sitting at our kitchen table with his readers low on his nose saying, "This is for both of you, but it's mainly to keep my girl safe." At the time, I laughed and told him not to worry. I was 37 then, sure I understood marriage, money, and life. At 58, sitting in my attic at 12:23 a.m., I wasn't laughing anymore. The lockbox wasn't locked. That was very much like Daddy. He trusted the box to be hidden well enough, then probably forgot where he put the key anyway. Inside were folders, yellowed papers, and an old envelope from a law office in downtown Asheville. The attorney's name was familiar, Peter Winslow. He had handled my parents' estate plan years ago. I opened the first folder. There were closing documents from when we bought the house. I skimmed them at first, not understanding what I was seeing. Then one phrase stopped me cold. Thompson Family Residential Trust. I read it again. And again. The house had not been titled directly to Mark and me. It had been placed into a trust my father created. My hands went cold. I kept reading slower this time. There were pages describing the property, the address, the trustee, and beneficiaries. My name appeared. Mark's did not. At first I thought I was mistaken. Legal papers have a way of making a person feel ignorant. I had spent 20 years helping with tax forms and payroll records, but trust language was something else entirely. So I gathered the documents, shoved them back into the box, and carried everything downstairs as quietly as I could. I didn't sleep. By 6 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with black coffee and a legal pad. Mark came in around 7 wearing his robe, looking mildly irritated that I was already awake. "Packing?" he asked. I looked up. "Starting today." He nodded like a landlord inspecting a tenant. "I think that's best." I wanted to throw the coffee in his face. I didn't. "What are your plans this weekend?" I asked, keeping my voice even. His expression changed slightly. "Why, I need to know when you'll be here." "I'm taking Claire to Charleston. We'll be back next Saturday." Of course he was. A weekend getaway while I packed my life into boxes. "That gives you plenty of time," he added. I smiled into my coffee. "It sure does." After he left for the office, I called the number on the old law office envelope. It had been disconnected. That didn't surprise me. Peter Winslow would have been in his 80s by then if he was still alive. I searched online, called 2 law offices, and finally learned his practice had closed 9 years earlier. The receptionist at the last office said some of his old files were transferred to Henderson and Bell on College Street. By 10:30, I was standing in their lobby with the lockbox hugged to my chest. A young receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I said no, but I may have a husband problem and a house problem, and I would appreciate someone telling me which one is worse. She stared at me for 1 second, then disappeared into the back. 15 minutes later, an attorney named Rachel Bell invited me into her office. Rachel was probably in her early 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair, and the calm expression of someone who had heard everything twice. She looked over the documents for nearly half an hour. I watched her face carefully. Finally, she leaned back. "Mrs. Harper, I don't want to give you a final answer until I confirm the county records and the trust status, but based on what I'm seeing, your husband may not have the right to make you leave. I gripped the edge of the chair. Does he own the house? Not in the way he seems to think he does. That sentence almost made me dizzy. Rachel explained that my father had structured the purchase in a way meant to protect the property. The trust had originally allowed Mark and me to live there as a married couple, but the beneficial interest appeared to remain with me. Your father was cautious, she said. He was stubborn, I replied. Rachel smiled. Sometimes those are cousins. Still, it wasn't simple. Some updated filings were missing. There had been a transfer amendment years earlier, and she needed the original. County records would help, but not enough. We needed proof the trust had never been dissolved. So what do I do until then? I asked. Do not move out permanently. Do not sign anything. Do not send angry texts. And do not tell him what we discussed yet. That last part was harder than it sounds, because when I got home, Mark was standing in the living room with a tape measure, measuring the wall, for Claire's furniture. I stood in the doorway watching him stretch the tape across the space where our wedding portrait had hung for 20 years. What are you doing? I asked. Claire has a sectional, he said, larger than ours. Our sofa is 8 years old. Exactly. I almost admired the nerve. Almost. That afternoon, my neighbor Betty Wilkins came over carrying banana bread wrapped in foil. Betty was 73, widowed, sharp as a tack, and had known me since Mark and I moved in. She found me in the garage surrounded by boxes. Don't tell me you're actually leaving, she said. I hesitated. Then I told her enough. Not everything, just enough. Betty listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set the banana bread on top of a box labeled Christmas. Then she said, well, that man always did look like he ironed his personality flat. I laughed so suddenly I had to sit down. It was the first real laugh I'd had in days. Betty leaned closer. What do you need? Honestly, I need someone to remind me I'm not crazy. Oh, honey, she said, patting my arm. Crazy people don't organize their boxes by room. Over the next 2 days, Betty became my unofficial lookout cheerleader and snack supplier. She brought soup, old gossip, and once a screwdriver I never asked for, but apparently might need if things got interesting. Meanwhile, Claire began posting pictures online. Betty showed me on her phone. Claire at a furniture store. Claire holding paint swatches. Claire captioning one photo. New beginnings deserve beautiful spaces. I stared at the screen. My throat tightened. It wasn't just betrayal. It was being erased while I was still standing there. By Friday morning, Mark left for Charleston with Claire. He gave me one last instruction before walking out. Please be gone before we get back. I nodded, but I wasn't gone. I was busy. Rachel called at 3:12 p.m. We found the county reference, she said. Now we need the original trust amendment. Do you have any idea where your father kept older personal papers? I looked around the garage. Boxes everywhere. Dust. Tape. 31 years of life piled like evidence. I'll find it, I said. I searched until my knees hurt. At nearly midnight, I opened a dented filing cabinet that had belonged to my father. Behind old insurance policies and a Sears appliance warranty from 1998, I found a blue folder. Inside was the amendment. Signed. Notarized. Valid. And tucked behind it was something else. A business loan document I had never seen before. Mark had used company assets as collateral. Without telling me. I sat down on the concrete floor of the garage and read until my eyes burned. The house wasn't the only thing Mark had misunderstood. And by the time he came home with Claire, he was going to learn that the hard way. I didn't realize how much stress I'd been carrying until someone finally told me I wasn't imagining things. That someone was Rachel Bell. Monday morning, 3 days after Mark left for Charleston with Claire, I sat across from her in a conference room overlooking downtown Asheville. The Blue Ridge Mountains were visible through the windows. Normally I loved that view. That morning I barely noticed it. Rachel had spread documents across the table in neat stacks. The trust papers, the amendment I'd found, county records, business documents, and the loan agreement that had kept me awake half the night. She tapped the trust paperwork first. The house issue is actually the easiest part. I blinked. Easiest? Yes. Rachel gave a small smile. The trust is active. The amendment is valid. The county records match. I stared at her. For the first time in a week, I felt my shoulders loosen. So he can't throw me out? No. The word landed like a deep breath after being underwater. Rachel continued. Legally speaking, Mark's position is much weaker than he realizes. I leaned back in my chair. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Mostly I felt sad. 31 years. 31 years together. And now I was sitting in a law office learning that my husband didn't actually understand the ownership of the home we'd lived in for 3 decades. Or maybe he understood and simply assumed I'd never question him. Honestly, I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. Rachel slid another document forward. Unfortunately, the house isn't the biggest issue. I looked down. The business loan agreement. My stomach tightened again. Tell me. She folded her hands. Mark pledged company assets as collateral. I know. What concerns me is how he did it. I frowned. Rachel pointed to several signatures. Your accounting business is structured as a partnership. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means he may not have had authority to do certain things without your knowledge. I sat completely still. For years I'd referred to the company as Mark's business. Everyone did. Clients, friends, neighbors, even me. But according to the paperwork, that wasn't entirely true. Years earlier, when the business expanded, my name had been added as a legal partner. I remembered signing documents at the time. I just never paid much attention. I trusted my husband. Rachel kept talking. The exact legal implications will take time to determine. How much time? Several weeks. I rubbed my forehead. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. The truth was becoming expensive and exhausting. By the time I left Rachel's office, my head hurt. The next few days weren't easy. Movies make revenge look exciting. Real life is mostly paperwork, phone calls, waiting, worrying. I spent hours gathering records, tax returns, bank statements, business reports, insurance documents. At night I lay awake wondering if I was doing the right thing. Somewhere around 3 o'clock one morning, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The neighborhood was silent. A few porch lights glowed in the distance. I thought about my marriage, about the first apartment Mark and I rented, about the vacations we'd taken, about all the ordinary moments that had once seemed permanent. Part of me wanted to walk away. Forget the house. Forget the business. Forget the fight. Start over somewhere else. The idea felt tempting. Then I remembered something. Not something dramatic. Something small. 3 years earlier, I'd worked 70-hour weeks helping save the company during a difficult tax season. I remembered skipping family gatherings, canceling plans, taking calls during dinner, helping keep everything afloat. And now Mark was trying to erase all of that. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was self-respect. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. My phone rang. Linda. The voice sounded familiar. Yes, this is Jim Watkins. I smiled immediately. Jim had owned a landscaping company and had been one of our accounting clients for nearly 20 years. We'd helped him through audits, payroll issues, and tax problems. Jim, how are you? There was a pause. Then he said, Betty told me what happened. Of course she had. In hindsight, expecting Betty to keep a secret was optimistic. I see. Listen, Jim said. You helped my business survive in 2012. Don't forget that. I wasn't sure where he was going. Then he added, if you need references, records, or somebody to remind people who actually ran that office, call me. I sat quietly. Unexpected tears filled my eyes. Thank you. Over the next week, similar conversations happened again and again. Former clients called. Friends checked in. A retired banker named Harold Franklin even offered to review some of the business records. Turns out my father wasn't the only person who had spent years quietly watching. People noticed more than I realized. Meanwhile, Mark seemed completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. Actually, unaware isn't the right word. Overconfident is better. Betty provided regular updates. Guess who ordered custom patio furniture? I sighed. Mark and Claire. The next day, guess who scheduled a housewarming party? Please don't tell me. Mark. Apparently, he planned to host a celebration the weekend after returning from Charleston. Neighbors, business contacts, friends, everyone was invited. The invitation described it as a new chapter gathering. Betty nearly choked laughing when she read it aloud. I wish I found it funny. Mostly I found it insulting. A marriage ended. A life got dismantled. And somehow it became a theme party. Thursday morning, Rachel called. Her voice sounded different. Excited. Linda. What happened? We received final confirmation. I sat upright. The trust? Yes, I held my breath. The trust remains fully enforceable. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Rachel continued. And there's more. My stomach tightened. The business documents support our concerns. I closed my eyes. So what happens now? There was a brief pause. Then Rachel said something unexpected.
We wait.
I frowned. Wait. Mark is about to make a very public mistake. I wasn't sure I liked where this was going. Rachel sensed my hesitation. You don't have to humiliate him.
Good.
But the truth needs to come out. That part I understood. The following afternoon, Rachel and I met again. She outlined a plan. A legal plan. Careful. Documented. Completely above board. No tricks. No schemes. Just facts. Yet the more she explained it, the more nervous I became. Because this wasn't happening in a courtroom. It was happening at the house. The house Mark believed belonged to him. The house he planned to share with Claire. The house where he intended to host his celebration. And according to Rachel, we were going to let him walk right into the consequences. I stared at the papers in front of me. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From the realization that after years of making decisions together, I was finally making one on my own. Rachel looked at me. You can still back out. I thought about that. Then I thought about Tuesday night. About being ordered out by Friday. About Claire picking paint colors for my living room. About 31 years being dismissed like an inconvenience. Finally, I nodded. No, Rachel smiled. Good. I took a deep breath. Outside, the mountains stood quiet beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, I signed the authorization forms. And for the first time since Mark's announcement, I wasn't reacting to his choices. I was preparing for mine. Saturday arrived warm and bright. The kind of North Carolina spring day that makes people open windows and spend extra time outside. Dog walkers filled the sidewalks. Neighbors worked in flower beds. The sky was impossibly blue. And by 10 o'clock that morning, I was standing in my own kitchen watching a locksmith change every lock on the house. Even then, part of me couldn't believe this was really happening. Not because it was illegal. Quite the opposite. Everything had been reviewed, documented, and approved. Rachel had been meticulous. The trust controlled the property. I was the beneficiary. Mark had no legal authority to remove me. For years, he'd operated on assumptions. Now he was about to meet reality. The locksmith finished around noon. He handed me a small ring of keys. All set, I thanked him, then stood quietly in the living room after he left. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, the same floors Mark and I had installed together 15 years earlier. The same room where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, life. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Betty arrived shortly afterward carrying a tray of deviled eggs. Emergency snacks, she announced. I laughed. Betty, this isn't a football game. She looked out the front window. Give it time. By mid-afternoon, Rachel arrived. Then a process server. Then a representative from the trust administration office. Everything happened calmly, professionally. No drama. Just paperwork. Legal notices. Official documentation. The front door received a sealed packet explaining the property status and immediate restrictions. Another packet addressed the business concerns. Every piece had been prepared carefully. Every signature verified. Every detail checked. No surprises, at least not for us. Around 4:30, neighbors started noticing activity. Not because we invited them. Because neighbors always notice activity. Especially in Asheville. Especially on quiet streets. By 5 o'clock, Betty had already spoken with half the neighborhood. I suspect she considered that community service. At 6:15, she walked back into the kitchen carrying iced tea. Word is spreading. I shook my head. You enjoy this way too much. Linda. She said, dead serious. I've been retired for 11 years. This is the most exciting thing that's happened on our street since Frank Morrison backed his RV into his own mailbox. Fair point. Then we waited. Around 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Rachel glanced at the screen. Mark. I nodded. Declined the call. A minute later, he called again. Then again. Then a text arrived. Running late. Be ready to leave tonight. Betty nearly fell off her chair laughing when I read it aloud. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. At 7:42 p.m., I heard tires crunching on the driveway. The room went completely silent. Even Betty stopped talking. Through the front window, I watched a black SUV pull up. Mark stepped out first. Claire followed. Both were dressed nicely. Weekend getaway clothes. Relaxed. Confident. Claire carried shopping bags. Mark carried a bottle of champagne. Neither of them had the slightest idea what was waiting. My pulse started racing. Not from fear. From anticipation. Because despite everything, this moment was real now. No more planning. No more paperwork. No more waiting. Mark walked toward the porch, smiling. Claire slipped her arm through his. He unlocked his phone, probably looking for messages. Then they reached the front door. And stopped. The new lock was immediately obvious. Mark frowned. Claire frowned too. He tried his key. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The smile disappeared. Then he noticed the documents attached beside the door. He stepped closer. Pulled one free. Started reading. I watched the exact moment confusion became concern. Then concern became panic. Claire leaned over his shoulder. What is it? No answer. He kept reading. His face drained of color. The champagne bottle slipped slightly in his hand. Claire grabbed the papers. Read faster. Then came the moment I'd seen in my mind 100 times. Mark looked up at the house, at the windows, at the front porch, and finally at me, standing calmly behind the glass. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Then he whispered, No. Claire stared at him. What? No. Louder this time. Then, No, this can't be happening. The exact words from the beginning of this story. The champagne bottle dropped. Glass exploded across the porch. Neither of them noticed. Mark rushed toward the door. Pulled the handle. Locked. Again. Locked. Again. Locked. Betty leaned toward me. I think he's testing whether reality changed in the last 3 seconds. I almost choked, trying not to laugh. Outside, several neighbors had wandered closer. Purely by coincidence, of course. Mark banged on the door. Linda. I opened it calmly. Not wide. Just enough. What? His eyes were wild. What is this? I looked at the paperwork. Those are legal documents. Don't play games. I'm not. Claire stepped forward. You can't lock him out. Rachel appeared beside me. Actually appeared. Like every lawyer in every movie. Perfect timing. She can, Rachel said. Mark turned. The confidence he'd worn all week vanished instantly. Rachel handed him another folder. Everything is explained in there. His hands shook while taking it. Claire grabbed pages and started reading. The further she read, the worse her expression became. Then she looked at Mark. What do you mean you don't own the house? Silence. What do you mean? More silence. The neighbors moved slightly closer. Mark looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. Then Rachel continued. And while we're discussing surprises, we should probably address the business records. That got his attention. Fast. His head snapped toward her. What business records? Rachel simply pointed to the second packet, the one discussing the loans, the undisclosed liabilities, the partnership issues, the things he'd assumed nobody would ever discover. Claire started reading again. Halfway through, she lowered the papers slowly. The look she gave Mark was almost impressive. Are you serious? Nobody answered. Claire laughed once, a short disbelieving laugh. Then she handed him the paperwork. You told me something very different. Claire. No. She stepped backward. You said this house was yours. Let me explain. You said the business was yours. More neighbors appeared. At this point, hiding would have required a smoke bomb. Claire looked around, then back at Mark. Then she did something nobody expected. She got into the SUV, alone, and drove away, leaving him standing there, holding legal documents, covered in humiliation, surrounded by witnesses. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As darkness settled over the mountains, Mark remained frozen on the porch. The man who had ordered me out by Friday no longer had a place to go. And 3 days later he called, asking for one final meeting. 3 days after the disaster on the front porch, Mark called. I let it ring twice before answering. Not because I wanted to punish him. I just needed a second to prepare myself. Hello. His voice sounded different immediately. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the man who had sat across from me at dinner and casually informed me that my replacement would be moving into the house. What remained sounded tired, old, human. Linda. I waited. I'd like to talk. I looked out the kitchen window toward the mountains. The dogwoods were blooming. Spring was moving forward whether any of us were ready or not. What about? A long silence. Then, everything. I wasn't sure I wanted that conversation. Part of me wanted to keep the door closed forever. Another part wanted answers. Not legal answers. Personal ones. The kind you spend years wondering about. So we agreed to meet. Not at the house. Not at a lawyer's office. At a small coffee shop downtown. The kind of place where retired couples linger over muffins and tourists ask for directions. Thursday morning. 10 o'clock. I arrived first. Old habit. Mark arrived 5 minutes later. and for a moment I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, in spirit. He ordered coffee, sat down across from me, then stared at his hands. For nearly 30 seconds neither of us spoke. Finally he said, "I deserve everything that's happened. That wasn't what I expected. I expected excuses, defensiveness, blame. Instead I got honesty, or at least the beginning of it." "What happened to you?" I asked quietly. Mark looked out the window. "I don't know." I believed that answer more than anything else he said that day. Because sometimes people don't destroy their lives in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it happens one compromise at a time, one selfish decision, one rationalization, one lie, then another, and another, until eventually they wake up somewhere they never intended to be. Mark rubbed his forehead. At first it felt harmless. "Claire," he nodded. "We talked." I stayed silent. "We flirted." Another pause. Then I convinced myself I deserved it. There it was. The sentence underneath every betrayal. I deserve it. People can justify almost anything once they start telling themselves that story. He stared into his coffee. The business was doing well. Because we worked hard. His eyes dropped. Yes. We. That word hung between us. For years he'd allowed people to believe he built everything alone. Now for the first time he acknowledged reality. The company had been ours. The sacrifices had been ours. The late nights had been ours. I didn't say any of that. I didn't need to. He already knew. Eventually, after losing everything, Mark sighed. "When your father died, I think something changed. That surprised me. My father, I was always intimidated by him." I almost smiled. Most people were. My father had a way of seeing through nonsense within about 30 seconds. Mark continued. "He never treated me badly. No. He just never fully trusted me. I thought about that, and remembered countless conversations over the years, small moments, little warnings, questions my father asked that I brushed aside. At the time I'd assumed he was being protective. Now I wondered if he'd noticed things I missed." Mark looked down. "I spent years trying to prove I was successful. By lying, by pretending." That answer felt closer to the truth. Because the affair wasn't really about Claire. Not entirely. Claire was younger, admiring, exciting. But underneath all that, I suspected Mark was chasing a version of himself he thought he'd lost. The problem was that fantasy eventually collided with reality. And reality won. Every time. For a while neither of us spoke. The coffee shop buzzed quietly around us. A waitress refilled cups. A man near the counter read a newspaper. Life continued. Ordinary. Uninterested in personal tragedies. Finally Mark asked, "Do you hate me?" I thought carefully before answering. "No." His eyes lifted. "Really?" "No." That didn't mean I wasn't hurt. It didn't mean I approved. It didn't mean I trusted him. It simply meant hatred no longer occupied space inside me. Carrying it had become exhausting. At some point I realized anger was keeping me tied to the worst chapter of my life. And I wanted to move forward, not backward. Mark nodded slowly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not." A sad smile crossed his face. "Fair." Then he surprised me. "I don't want the house." I blinked. "What?" "I know it's yours." The statement seemed obvious now. Yet hearing him say it mattered. Acceptance matters. Truth matters, especially after years of denial. He continued. "I'll cooperate with the settlement." I nodded. "Good." "And Linda?" "Yes." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." For a moment 31 years flashed through my mind. The first apartment. Road trips. Christmas mornings. Ordinary Tuesdays. Arguments. Laughter. Losses. Victories. An entire lifetime compressed into a few seconds. Then I said the only honest thing I could. "I know." And strangely enough I did. The apology didn't fix anything. It didn't erase what happened. But it was real. That mattered. The legal issues took several more months to resolve. The business was divided fairly. The loans were addressed. The paperwork eventually ended. Life moved forward. Slowly. The way real healing usually does. Today, nearly 3 years later, I'm sitting on the same back porch where I once cried at 3 in the morning wondering whether my life was over. It wasn't. If anything, it was beginning again. The house remains in the family. The garden is thriving. Betty still appears without warning carrying food nobody asked for. And every now and then I help women at the community center understand trusts, wills, finances, and the importance of paying attention to documents they once ignored. including me. If there's one lesson I learned from all this, it's that strength doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to surrender your dignity when someone else has forgotten your value. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so peaceful that bitterness no longer has room to live there. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment that forced you to rediscover your own strength? Feel free to share your experience. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, second chances, and real-life lessons, you're always welcome to come back for another one. The end.